What it do, cuckolds? It's your boy, the Hater. Once again, Hater on the road up in this piece. And I wanted to do a video on the importance of the Attitude Era and why the Attitude Era was the best time for wrestling, right? Now, I'm not doing this video to reiterate things that everyone else has said. I am doing this as probably the most informative video that you can find on the subject matter that is not like 3 hours long. And it's going to explain, basically the Cliff Notes version of why the Attitude Era is held in such high regard, right? I'm making this mostly as a service to the people that weren't around for the Attitude Era, or the people that were around but weren't wrestling fans, right? Just so that everyone can understand what made the Attitude Era so special. Now, in order to understand the Attitude Era, we have to understand the time period in question, right? The late 90s and into the early 2000s, but realistically, just the late 90s is when the Attitude Era was not only at its peak, but when the Attitude Era was the best, right? Because then it started kind of like falling off. I personally am one of those people that thinks that the Attitude Era ended when the Invasion angle started. Like there was still attitude, you know what I mean? But that wasn't the thing, Like Attitude Era wasn't a thing anymore. Like we weren't really concerned with that. There was like a much bigger story called the Invasion. So, let's stop right there. Early 2000s, right? Now, here's the thing about the Attitude Era. Number one, the 90s were a period of great prosperity, right? A lot of people don't remember this, but the 90s, the economy was doing great under Bill Clinton. Say what you want about him, but Bill Clinton got the economy rolling, you know what I mean? Everything was just kind of good, right? There was no, the racial tension and the gender-based tension that we have today just really wasn't a thing. Now, I know some people will say, well, you don't know what it's like being black. I don't, but you understand what I'm saying. There's no tension. People were much more open about it, right? Everybody was able to say whatever the fuck they wanted and nobody really cared, right? Same thing with gender stuff, right? Gay people and trans people, all that other stuff, that just wasn't really a thing. Like, obviously there was gay people around, but believe me, the general consensus was that nobody likes gays, and there's a few people that were okay with other people being gay, and those people were pretty much just called gay as well, right? So I'm laying down the cultural foundations here, right? Because the Attitude Era gets a lot of flack for being homophobic or for being a little bit racist or whatever, right? But it's just this is just how things were back then, number one. I'm not saying it was good or bad, I'm just saying that's how they were, right? So beyond that, the 90s were just a period where the entire marketing of the world shifted from things being useful to things being wholesome to finally things being cool, right? Everything that you know and love from the 90s was presented as being cool, right? It wasn't presented as oh, this is great, this is a great device. It was yeah, in your face, get this, get on a mountain bike, do a flip, break your leg, who gives a flying fuck, right? And this was reflected by all the entertainment of the time, right? You had bands like Limp Bizkit, right? Limp Bizkit, now here's the thing about Limp Bizkit. I'm sure there's other bands like Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park and everything else, but Limp Bizkit really is the one that we want to focus on, right? That exists today, there's no doubt about it. But nobody knows who the fuck they are. They're not mainstream, right? Limp Bizkit was mainstream. They were top of the notch. Everyone in middle school and high school loved Limp Bizkit. Kid Rock, eventually Linkin Park. Then you had other things that were more niche-y, but they were still mainstreamish, right? So Marilyn Manson is a great example, right? Is there an analog to Marilyn Manson today? Of course there is, right? Of course there's a guy that makes that kind of music, but nobody knows who the fuck they are, right? Because Marilyn Manson was mainstream, right? Now, he wasn't as mainstream, but he was mainstreamish. Everybody knew he was a household name, right? Whereas now, whatever the fuck people listen to, Lamb of God, right? Nobody knows who the fuck those people are, right? Nobody knows any of these things, right? Now, I wasn't a fan of Marilyn Manson at the time or anything like that, but I knew who he was. You know what I'm saying? I was a kid, but I knew who he was. So the entire marketing of the 90s was cool type shit, right? When you're a kid playing with your friends and there's that one kid who's older than you and he's cooler than you, everything was marketed to that guy, right? And the idea was you market to that guy and that guy just disseminates it downstream, right? So, for example, PlayStation, right? PlayStation 1 was marketed as the console of cool people, right? N64 was the console of nerds and families. PS1 was you're not a nerd, you don't have a family, right? In the sense that you play games with. You're just a guy that likes games, and you're cool, right? PS1, that's the one you want, right? That's how it was marketed. Wrestling was no different. One of you quoted Al Snow in one of the comments, and apparently Al Snow said that wrestling reflects society, right? I like that. That's a good quote, and it's true. If society's boring, and now you want to push fat people and losers and people that have no business being on TV, then you're gonna get that, right? That makes just perfect sense, right? So a great example would be AEW starts like opening its doors, and immediately, like of their first like 10 signings, they signed Nyla Rose, who's a transgender, and Sonny Kiss, who is like, I think back then Sonny Kiss was a gay man, but now they identify as like a pansexual or some other bullshit, I mean, gender non-binary, I don't know, I don't care, right? Now, good for them for identifying this way, you know what I mean? I ain't hating on anybody, but it's like, it's just a sign of the times, right? That kind of stuff was popular, and kind of still is popular, you know, to be transgender and to be like gender non-binary, those other things. So like, it's gonna be reflected in the wrestling, right? Back in the day, in the 90s, that wasn't what was cool. What was cool was banging broads, right? Making money because the economy was booming, right? And just overall being a badass. That was just part of the culture. Now, in my personal opinion, Americans aren't quite known for being badasses for the most part. Like, I've noticed my entire life in America that American men of any race or religion, I couldn't think of the word for a second, they're just kind of like soft. Like, Americans are just kind of soft. And don't get me wrong, I love you Americans, you know, I'm a US citizen right now, but American men are soft, right? Like, when you come from a different part of the world and you see how men behave here, you're like, this is like if my country had more people, we would conquer you in like 3 days, you know what I mean? Like, that's just how, and you know, now it's even worse, but it's always been like that, right? There's always been a lot of men complaining in America, and complaining is just not a good sign of a man. So, but despite this, in the 90s, there was a drive to be badass, right? Again, obviously, I'm talking about the averages here, right? Like, America also produced Brock Lesnar. America also produced, like, fucking John Wayne. You know what I mean? America is not, like, it's not all pussies, right? There's a lot of pussies. And nowadays, everyone's a pussy. Everyone's afraid of their own shadow. Like, there was a study that said that, like, 60% of men are afraid to ask a woman to get a drink, right? And it's like, what the fuck? Like, what are you afraid of? Worst case, she'll say no. Now, granted, the age is 36, so, like, I get it. If you're, like, 17, okay, I get it. You know, we were all 17 once, but you understand what I'm getting at. Now, after this 8-minute or so rant that I just made on the culture, we move on to the Attitude Era, right? The Attitude Era encapsulated all of the parts, all of the bad parts, if you will, all of the aggressiveness of American culture in the 90s, right? And discarded all the bullshit, right? So, what did you get as a result? Badasses and hot babes. That's all everyone wanted, right? In addition, there was a form of liberalism that is unique to the 90s and doesn't really get discussed too much, right? So there's like the liberalism of, like, you know, the 70s, right? Where, you know, like hippie movements and things like that, like free love, like everyone fucking everyone and everyone doing drugs. But that was a little bit tame compared to the 90s, right? Because that was all like, yeah, man, like, the corporations are after us, bro. Like, let's all just be peaceful. That's one thing, right? The 90s was the exact opposite. It was like, fuck peace. I'm going to break this table for no reason whatsoever, right? I'm going to rage, motherfuckers. I'm going to rage. That's what the 90s was all about. And within that, there came this other form of liberalism of nobody having any shame, right? Like, zero shame, motherfuckers. Zero shame. You'd see like the Jerry Springer show, people just humiliating themselves for attention, right? All of these things have gotten worse. But because this already happened in the 90s, nobody is impressed by, like, someone making a pie on TikTok, right? Because I saw a dude throw up on a woman's head because that was their sexual fetish on Jerry Springer. So I don't think you baking an apple pie is going to, like, get me excited, motherfuckers. I've seen it all, you know? In the 90s, you saw it all. Now it's just a bunch of people being like, oh, I wonder how many balloons are required to lift me off the ground. Like, shut the fuck up, you know? Like, I've seen people, like, you know, I've seen dead bodies, motherfuckers. You know what I'm saying? I've seen dead bodies. I don't think, like, I need to worry about that kind of stuff. So the point is, the Attitude Era captured everything perfectly, right? It captured the zeitgeist, as the German word goes, right? The zeitgeist. Zeitgeist in German means time ghost, motherfucks. So the spirit of the time, it captured it perfectly. Wrestling got that. Now, there is no zeitgeist. The zeitgeist now is like a bunch of weird liberal men and women and a bunch of, in my opinion, arguably equally weird Republican and conservative men and women, right? There's like, everyone's just like this. Like, I'll give you an example, motherfuckers. Yesterday, there was some boxing match, right? It was like this woman's match. One woman was from Italy. She got her ass whooped by another individual who was from Algeria, right? Now, the story that was presented in the media was that the Algerian was a trans woman, right? And a lot of people ran with this, including that dork, J.D. Vance, who I can't believe, this guy's gonna fucking ruin the entire Trump campaign, if you ask me. But anyways, a lot of people ran with this. They're like, oh, it's a trans woman, right? And I said this to my fiance, and she was like, no, you're wrong, it's not. She did some research, and it turns out this individual was born a woman, right? They have elevated natural levels of testosterone, but so do different men, right? Like the level of testosterone that, naturally speaking, that Great Khali has is much higher than that of, Adam Cole, right? They're both men, right? If they were the same weight, they would fight each other. So the idea is that, like, it's just, the point I'm trying to make is that it's weird on both sides, right? The people on the right kind of went after this person, and they're like, oh, this is it's a man beating a woman. She's not a man, right? And okay, fine. If you want to classify her as a man based on some other parameters, right? You have to be transparent, you have to be honest, right? This is not the same issue as trans women fighting women. It's a completely different thing, right? But because everyone falls into these two camps of, quite frankly, retarded people, like you have like J.D. Vance, that cuck, right? He made a career for himself saying that Trump is Hitler, and then he switched sides, basically. He changed it. Oh, I was wrong about that. Like, what kind of a leader is that? What kind of a man is that, right? So it's like you have a bunch of people on both sides that don't think for themselves, and they just go on. That is the present zeitgeist. And looky, milk and cookie. That's what's happening in wrestling too. It's a bunch of people on extremes, right? You just have faces and heels. Nobody explains why their faces are heels. They just are. They just are. Like, why is Sol Sikoa mean? He just is. Okay, fine. He just is. Why is Cody a face? Doesn't do anything great except for, lose and then win, right? Like, get his ass whooped and then win. Why is he a face, right? None of these things are explained. In the Attitude Era, all of this stuff was perfectly articulated. And it was done so mostly through the use of gimmicks and storylines, right? So nobody would just like go out there and you'd be like, oh, Val Venus, what is his gimmick? He's a porn star, right? You wouldn't ask, oh, is he a good porn star or is he an evil porn star? You wouldn't ask that, right? He would just be a porn star. And depending on the context, he might be good or he might be evil, right? Like, depending, for example, in the Goldust match, he was evil because he slept with Goldust's wife, right? So the actions define the wrestler, not the scenario by itself and not the wrestler by itself. So with all that being said, this needs to be like a multi-episode thing because I went on a few rants on this one. Maybe we'll do another video that more clearly explains the Attitude Era parts, but I think the point's been made. The Attitude Era was good for two reasons. Number one, a good reliance on gimmicks and storylines, and two, it captured the zeitgeist, right? And people got excited. And that's why I always say, Cucks, in other videos, I always say, if you weren't part of the Attitude Era, like if you weren't there, right? Because it's not just the wrestling, right? It's the surroundings. So like, I would look forward to Mondays, motherfucks. And Monday is like a school day. I would go to school and everyone would basically talk about, oh, what's gonna happen tonight on Monday Night Raw. Everyone. This is like in 5th grade and 4th grade. Oh, do you think Sting is gonna do this on Nitro? Oh, do you think like Stone Cold's gonna do that? Everybody talked about it. Kids would get into fights whether they like based on whether they supported like the NWO or the Wolfpack. Like people would fight in real life. Like that's how much of fans we had, right? Like you see somebody today fighting over who's better, Jey Uso or Finn Balor? No, nobody's gonna give a shit. They're gonna be like, oh, okay, I have no interest in talking about this anymore, right? So the reality is that the surroundings of the Attitude Era were just as important, right? Because what would happen is then on Monday something would happen and you'd be like, oh my God, we have 3 days to like talk about what's gonna happen, on Thursday Night SmackDown, right? Because SmackDown was on Thursdays originally. So you see what I'm saying? Or Thursday Night Thunder, right? A lot of discussions. Or wait, Thunder was on Wednesdays, I think. Yeah, I don't know. So point is, A lot of different discussions were made about wrestling, right? And the wrestling was so exciting that everyone would get excited. The pay-per-view structure made it even worse or better, depending on how you look at it, right? Because a lot of people, for example, like there was a period of time when I just started watching wrestling, and I wouldn't get the pay-per-views because like my mom would be like, why would we pay for this? You see it for free on Mondays. And I'm like, I couldn't really explain it to her. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Like, they're going to talk about it on Monday, I guess, right? Then eventually I became a huge fan, so I started begging my mom. So, I would get the occasional pay-per-view, and then eventually it became every pay-per-view because I became a big fan, right? Not every, but like, I would base it basically on like whether it's worthwhile to like ask her to do it for me, to be reasonable. So the idea is like some kids didn't get to see the pay-per-view, but others did. So then people would go on like AOL Instant Messenger and like talk about it, right? There was an excitement that was specific to the Attitude Era, but without the people, right? Without people being willing to discuss it, there ain't nothing to discuss, cucks. With that being said, take care of yourselves and fuck your mothers.